Hi everyone, we are now back to the live stream. Welcome everyone joining on YouTube. We're moving into the second talk of the day. We have now Dr. Paula Boddington. She is a senior research in philosophy at the New College of the Humanities, founding editor of the journal AI and Ethics, and she was part of the AI for People 2020 committees. Today, she will be presenting us Philosophy of AI through the Theory and Practice of Dementia. Welcome, Paula.
Thanks. Hello, everybody, and thanks for being here today. When you could be so many other places, in a sense, that's quite a good introduction to some of the things I'm going to be talking about. Because one of the things that I'm going to be talking about is some work that I've been doing with a team of medical sociologists who are ethnographers, looking at the experiences on acute hospital wards of people living with dementia. And one of the difficulties for anybody suddenly being admitted to hospital is that it's a very confusing place. And if you add to that the experience of having dementia, it can make it much worse. So my experience of, I've done this so many times and I've forgotten it. So that's a really good introduction to how confusing it is. And in particular, I think that we can all at the moment really relate to the difficulties of trying to relate to each other as human beings because of this. We're doing this online, and so I hope that's quite a good introduction, despite my failings, for which I apologise. So my talk is looking at themes arising from the chance circumstances of having been working for the last few years on two seemingly very different areas of research at once. So on the one hand, for several years, I've been examining the ethical issues in AI, and I've also been working with a team of ethnographers based at Cardiff University under the leadership of Dr Katie Featherstone, who are examining the routine care of people living with dementia who are on hospital wards with the aim of trying to improve the humanity of care. So despite the seeming vast gulf between these different areas of research, there's really quite a lot to be learned from considering both of them together. So it's really been a really fruitful and fascinating opportunity. But also there are really striking differences in how these different subjects are perceived. For example, if we think of AI as about achieving the really highest levels possible in cognitive capacity, and we can also see dementia through the lens of a model of cognitive deficit and loss. And it's in part because of this noticeable chasm that interesting questions arise. But this talk is also a methodological reflection on the value of working in such contrasting fields, and they contrast in so many ways. On the one hand, the lure of the new, the lure of progress, of high value on one side, and on the other, the old, the aged, the neglected, and remarkably unglamorous. If you're not convinced of a lack of glamour, much of our work focuses on issues such as continence care, and in work considering the clothing of people living with dementia on hospital wards, the topic is indeed glamour, or its lack. But there's one thing I will just say at the beginning, because a lot of the work coming from my fellow colleagues who are ethnographers is looking at ways in which the care of people living with dementia in hospital can be improved. But I want to get out of the way to say that none of the research is pointing a finger at staff. None of it is critical of individual staff. It's looking at institutional forces. So I'm only going to be able to give you a flavour of our work here today, which represents both work in progress and work that we hope to do in the future regarding the implementation of AI and other technology to assist those living with dementia. So what I'm going to present is going to amount to a flavour of some of the groundwork for a fruitful conversation between ethnography and technology within a particular setting. It might not be quite what you expect in a workshop on AI, but then always expect the unexpected. So, one of the topics which links between these two areas is persons. Themes linking the work on dementia care and work on AI ethics include questions such as how the person is understood conceptually and how each individual person is seen or not seen. Questions of dehumanization arise from this and are an important consideration in examining proposals for the use of AI, robotics, and other technology in the care of people living with dementia or for aged care in general, and the possible advantages and dangers. But there's also a linking theme methodologically which running through both of these areas of ethical questions in AI and of a work which aims to help achieve the highest quality of care within hospitals, care which values and recognises the humanity of the person, which is the task of facing each of joining highly abstract questions of value with their concrete, down-to-earth application, and how precisely we manage this. Focus on the application of technology to context can and should examine the technical and operational aspects of integrating the technology within a specific organisational, institutional and cultural context. We can see this as a focus upon task and upon the efficient achievement of any explicit end goals. But the work of the ethnographers with whom I collaborate strongly suggests that we also need to see and to prioritise a more phenomenological apprehension of how the person appears and how the person as an individual is recognised within the setting of a busy, task-focused environment. Much of this work attends to the visual presentation of a person within a social context, and we also consider the impact of signs and symbols, or what we call technologies of attention. Some of the goals of the work of the hospital wards may also inadvertently act to help eclipse the perception of agency and personhood in people living with dementia, as I shall try to explain. So, tightly enmeshed in this is the particular question of how we see and recognise persons, how people may become endangered, how persons may become seen as marginal, and what can go awry in particular contexts, and why. This interacts with the more theoretical question of how the person is understood conceptually. There's some potential lessons from the team's detailed ethnographic work examining what happens in the ward, both for how AI or robotics might be implemented in practice, including, of course, the humanity of the application of technology, and for considering broad ideological assumptions driving both AI and the work of a hospital ward. So often a value can become a disvalue when it's taken out of context or when it's permitted to override other values. Where there are sympathies between the values of different spheres, we could achieve much. But the converse of this is that there may be a danger of an even more skewed amplification of values, which might even more effectively distort or drown out the quieter voices. So, for example, here are some of the suggestions for the use of robotics and AI in relation to dementia, which make us a little bit suspicious. So here, a suggestion that robotics could provide care for the elderly and companionship, suggestions which have increased lately as part of a growing emphasis on technology during the pandemic. Now, of course, robotics and other such technology could have some utility, could provide amusement and diversion. But what we notice that it's routinely described in ways which ignore many of the vital questions. Much of our work casts doubt on some simplistic suggestions for the use of robotics, as I shall indicate. Much of this is because of a lack of attention to the incredible complexity of social interactions, and much as well, it must be said, because of very common scorn for care work and for those who carry it out. But the story is more complex than this. So one lesson is how technology can very easily eclipse the person, but this lesson is perhaps made more vivid by consideration of how readily the person living with dementia is so often already eclipsed from sight on the hospital ward, and hence may be in particular peril of being overshadowed by technology. And consider how underlying models and assumptions of value can have an impact. We consider a particular lens through which the person living with dementia is seen, a cognitive deficit model. Now, it's really important to note that none of this is to deny that dementia will lead to certain cognitive deficits, although they can vary quite a lot in different forms of dementia and for different individuals. Problems arising from such cognitive difficulties are often, but not always, a direct source of many of the issues with which we're concerned. So our concerns are rather with the consequences of looking at the person living with dementia in front of you through this lens and this lens only, of using the disease model in ways which act to blur the person. This too can directly or indirectly lead to serious issues which can impact not just on welfare and happiness, but on health and on disease progression. Now, this short extract from an article chosen virtually at random from Wired magazine a couple of years ago about the use of technology to diagnose dementia illustrates some of the thoughts that we've been contemplating and considering the implications of. So this is about, as it says here, creating the first global benchmark in history for one of the earliest known symptoms of dementia. So you can develop symptoms of dementia many, many years before the disease is actually manifested in any ways which is going to have any real impact on your life. And just to quote later on, to go back to the professor in Berlin, he explained what happens to patients when they start developing dementia. They are driven nuts, this is, of course, this is not my words, but his, because they realise they're going to lose everything they have. It's not so much of an issue when they have dementia, because then they're gone. But this process of losing your, how can I say this, your human beingness, and you realise how you deteriorate, that's the hardest thing. So this illustrates our concerns with how, now, I want to draw your attention to the common way expressed in different senses in which this cognitive deficit model is linked to the ideas of a loss of human beingness. Now, none of this, of course, is to deny the difficulty and the pain of the disease process. It's to look at the implications of ways of conceptualizing the condition for those people who are living with dementia, and indeed for others who may be perceived as coming under this umbrella, because what we find in hospital wards is that you may be labelled as having dementia when you haven't. And note too, actually, something which I only noticed yesterday, because I didn't even notice it myself the first few times I read the passage. It's not so much of an issue when they have dementia, because then they are gone. Note, this assumes that dementia is an all or nothing condition, which comes on all of a sudden, and it's not usually the case. Now, we also need to look very carefully at the complex feedback loops that can arise. Routine care practices and the very use of seemingly humane technology can often send things backwards, quite inadvertently. And this can especially happen when high-level goals and values implicit in organisations may fall out of alignment with the needs and goals of individuals within an organisation or an institution, or may fall into conflict with less clearly articulated values. We have many examples from observations on wards which illustrate how chasing goals driven by certain underlying values may be sadly counterproductive. And I'll have time to just illustrate only a snapshot of these. And this looping, really importantly, can make it very hard to know whether or not we have correctly identified what a problem is, which is going to be critical for when you're considering how you might introduce technology as a means of solving the problem. So there's much to be said here, including observing that there are issues around how we might view this for ourselves, issues about how we might be inclined to view others. And the work of my colleagues, in fact, illustrates many of this in action. So to summarise our broad concerns so far, similar background assumptions and values found in some approaches to technology and towards people living with dementia may act to reinforce each other in ways which could be beneficial, but which could have really serious problems. The ethnographic approach identifies modes of dehumanization and the loss of a person within the goals and values of the institution. And technology must be used in really intelligent, selective ways which target well-identified issues to avoid reinforcing current problems. Now, much about this work can be seen at the website for the project, storiesofdementia.com. So as I said, the team's led by Katie Featherstone, and other members in it include colleagues such as Andy Northcott and many, many others. And it also draws on input from people living with dementia themselves and their families and carers, as well as a nursing staff. Interestingly, I'd just like to point out that the image you can see of Lost of the Little Figures is from one of the workshops that held by the team collaborating with people living with dementia and their carers, and using art as a way of helping people to express how they feel about the experience of being within hospital. The importance of this work is also underlined by the size of the population. So I won't go into too much detail here, but just to emphasise that people living with dementia make up between 1/4 and 1/2 of all hospital beds. So we're talking about people admitted to acute hospital wards for a condition additional to dementia, where they make up between 1/4 and 1/2 of all patients. So it's a really, really large number of people. And admission to hospital is likely to result in worse outcomes for people living with dementia compared to patients of similar age and similar admitting conditions who don't have a diagnosis of dementia. And our team's work indicates that some of this can be at least partially explained by unintended deleterious impacts of their care. Now, Katie and Andy's book has recently been released. It's staggeringly expensive if you buy the hardback, but the Kindle edition is free to download on Amazon. So if you're interested, I really encourage you to do this. It's called Wandering the Wards. Wandering the Wards refers to the ways in which people living with dementia on hospital wards are seen to exhibit meaningless behaviour that doesn't sit well with the routinised and timetabled efficiency of a hospital. The research has the goal of using ethnography to understand the meanings of the social world. So the goal of our team is to understand some key issues that are of significance for clinical practice. How is the condition of dementia understood? Models of a person and implications for ethics. Navigating the hierarchical and very structured world of the hospital ward, and questions of potentially competing ethical values. So, what are the broad themes, areas of consideration and overlap? We look at some of the underlying values and goals driving hospital culture, many of which chime very readily with implicit underlying values of much technology. We need to look at the organisational culture and how technology fits into this, and how people fit into this. There are implicit governing values of speed and of efficiency. We found progress models of time and behaviour and expected timetables. One of the important issues is the role of recorded data and monitoring and forms of accountability. And we look at an implicit overriding lens of cognition, a deficit model of dementia and cognitive impairment. And all this seen together can result in the stress of cognition and on time pressures, and the organisational culture can result in deleterious impacts on how the person is understood and how each individual person is seen. So, in summary, we have found that people living with dementia may have difficulty in living up to the demands of a culture of a fast-paced hospital ward, with an expectation of compliance to rules and where fitting into what is going on around you is prioritised. Deviation is seen as evidence of decline and disease progression, and a person may sometimes become literally invisible, disappearing into the bed. So in a nutshell, the values of efficiency of task are very often at odds with the values of recognition of a person by themselves and by others. And this can lead into looping, into where attempts by a person to communicate are misunderstood and are seen to rather indicate a progression of a condition and a lack of agency. Now, of course, again, none of this is not to say, we're not saying that efficiency is not a value, it's just that it may become out of kilter with other values. And there are many different overlapping and interesting facets of this. So I'm just going to now whiz through some of the findings of my colleagues' research. But as I said, if you're interested, please do download their book, and we have some papers which I'll refer to at the end. So firstly, to look at the practice which we've called stripping. I think I've gone, hang on, I've gone too far. Oh yeah, I've gone too far, sorry. Practices of stripping. Now this brings together ward cultures of speed, efficiency and cleanliness, which of course are completely comprehensible in a hospital. They're all totally understandable goals. And note actually that they're goals that technology is likely to aspire to increase still further. So by the practices of stripping, we mean things such as dressing people in hospital issue gowns, pyjamas and socks. But my colleagues found that people living with dementia were far more likely to be dressed in institutional clothing than were younger patients. We also refer to the practice of placing possessions out of sight within bedside lockers, which were often locked or inaccessible, especially for people living with dementia. And in fact, people living with dementia and older patients were much less likely to have any personal possessions on the bedside locker. There are personal possessions such as chocolates, gifts, flowers, not flowers, you don't have flowers anymore, balloons and so on and so forth. And it's really actually common that possessions are going to be lost. So even possessions such as handbags, clothing, and actually really commonly teeth, false teeth and glasses. And interestingly, the neat and tidy wards extended to the person being part of a neat and tidy, it's literally as if they're part of the furniture, extended to the person remaining in bed or at the bedside. Many of the wards had so-called dementia-friendly resources or even rooms. They largely remained unused. Now, the significance of this, I realise I'm whizzing through this, and I'll refer you to some papers if you're interested in more detail. We need to consider twin aspects of clothing and appearance. And remember, we're considering this in terms of how the person is seen and grasped, and the importance of that in terms of relating to a person as another human being with moral standing. In the same sort of way as I'm frantically trying to relate to you as an audience, but I can't see any of you, and I'm possibly hundreds of miles away from any of you. Self-perception and perception by others. And these may be especially important in an acute ward environment to get your basic needs recognised. Emphasising pace and speed, as we shall see in more detail later, and demands of verbal communication and compliance with instruction within the pace of a ward may be particularly taxing for some people living with dementia. And you also have to remember, these are people by and large who've just suddenly been admitted to hospital, perhaps with an underlying condition such as a urinary tract infection, which commonly causes confusion. This may lead to a perception of loss of personhood and a perception of loss of social status. So for patients living with dementia, may be struggling with the impacts of an additional acute medical condition within a highly timetabled, regimented and unfamiliar environment. And then staff perceptions, they then feed into clinical assessments of their condition and subsequent treatment and discharge pathways. Yet, attention to appearance, clothing and personal possessions can act as a counter to this loss of social standing, as has long been recognised by sociologists examining the hospital, or the total institution, to give it the name that Irving Goffman called it. So sociologists such as Goffman and Roth, Julius Roth talks about the process of stripping the patient of moral and social identity within the institution. The work of others more recently has drawn attention to the role that clothing can have on preserving visibility, identity and dignity of people living with dementia. And conversely, institutional clothing can have the reverse impact. And there are so many instances that my colleagues have found where this does in fact indeed seem to be the case, on where assisting a person with dementia to wear their own clothing can have an actually really quite dramatic impact on their self-perception and how they're perceived by others. Now, and again, I'm also going through a lot of empirical research, but also really condensing a lot of background philosophical work, because these all factors all together help to question a reliance on an overly mentalistic conception of a self or the person. Research has shown that felt familiarity with clothing is an important factor in retaining a sense of self and of social position, particularly in people living with dementia. In our published work, we refer to the work of a Canadian sociologist, Pia Contis, who's also done a lot of ethnographic work on people living with dementia, and who draws upon a more embodied notion of personhood and of the importance of social relationship and social standing for the continued recognition of agency by self and by others. Yet the hospital ward, operating, as it were, on a cognitive model of a person, which relies upon verbal communication and readily understanding of the social word of a ward, prioritises those very capacities which may be weakened in people living with dementia. Now, just to introduce a different topic, which also interacts with everything that we've seen on the ward, reducing risk and preventing falls. This can be seen as an example of how attention to a particular goal, of one goal to the neglect of others. So of particular concern to the staff was the risk of people living with dementia falling or having a fall, or leaving the ward and absconding. So falls are measured and prioritised. They must be reported. As a powerful sense of urgency often displayed the underlying anxiety of staff with repeated warnings to patients, emphasising the potential risks and imminent danger. And this, together with other concerns such as that of tidiness, led to a lot of containment, restriction and restraint, of tightening of care practices at the bedside. So for practices such as the raising of bedside rails or bars so people can't get out of bed, which actually often led to patients trying to climb over the bars and then hence having a fall, tucking in bed sheets very, very tightly to stop the person getting out of bed, technologies such as chair alarms, which if you've never come across one, is when you're sitting in a chair by the side of your bed and you get up to get a stretch and a ghastly alarm goes off to try to keep people staying where they are. So now, again, of course, falls are a genuine issue, and avoidance of falls is an important target, especially for older people, where it can easily lead to fractures. But this shows the perils of focus on what can be measured, what can be placed in a neat category. And all of this is likely, there's a danger this kind of problem can become increased with the data demands of technology, because recorded data may act to eclipse other values, and in practice may lead to a less than optimal outcome, because attempts to prevent falls may lead to inaction, which causes an acceleration of decline and deconditioning, especially in older patients, which can lead to really sustained stays in hospital. And additionally, the target of preventing falls leads to these certain restrictions, and attempts by patients to try to get around those restrictions can be seen as the person trying to resist, and a person resisting can be seen as evidence of cognitive decline and evidence of irrationality. So the behaviour is seen as irrational, as pointless wandering, thus feeding into a perception of loss of personhood and of agency. So, for example, a patient attempting to walk to the toilet, maybe repeatedly return to the bed, only to attempt this again, and rather seeing as a rational activity, it's seen as purposeless. So that's a really quick lightning tour of those issues. We've also looked at what we call actual technologies of attention. Now, these are often found within acute wards to indicate people who are living with dementia. It's also interesting that there are no other conditions that are, these are on semi-public boards, so there are no other health conditions that are sort of semi-publicly announced this person has this particular condition. Now, they're designed to try to alert staff to particular care needs that people living with dementia might have. But however, they bring about specific types of visibilities and invisibilities in the person living with dementia, and it helped to shape understandings both of the condition and of older people living within the ward. Because the more immediately visible signage representing dementia actually reinforces the invisibility of the person while highlighting the visibility of their diagnosis. So one of the things that happens is that the signs and the people are often moved independently of others. So you could have somebody who obviously hasn't got dementia with one of these signs by the side of their bed. It risks patients inadvertently receiving inappropriate care or erroneous understandings of their needs and erodes the visibility of the sign itself. But there's also a problem when the signs are actually used correctly, because, or rather, I mean, when the sign is labelling somebody who actually has a diagnosis of dementia, because we found that the use of a signage indicating dementia leads to a broad assumptions about care needs. So I refer back to that sentence I picked out of a quote from Wired magazine, the idea that dementia is a unified condition. So the signage reinforced the organisational expectations that typically people living with dementia always needed certain high levels of support. So, for example, there was often an assumption that if you had a sign indicating dementia that you needed to be fed, and those people were often referred to on the wards as feeders, which is not necessarily the case. When you remember that a lot of people would have been admitted straight from home where they were living independently or living with a spouse or another family member and fully able to feed themselves. So these expectations informed routine care practices that actually limited opportunities for people living with dementia to rehabilitate and to regain their independence. Okay, so this is the kind of sort of example of how, without thinking really carefully about what the needs of the people are, you might then think we need to introduce technology here when actually you need to take a step back and see what's actually happening. So this helped to shape understandings both of the condition and of older people on the ward in general. So the dementia patient became a very specific type and classification of the older patient. And actually interestingly, that often helped to reinforce people who were quieter. So it often helped to reinforce the idea of that person's got dementia because they're making a lot of, they're resisting and being really difficult. It's nearly always viewed as being in its later stages. And again, remember, these are ordinary acute hospital wards. We're not talking about dementia specialist care wards. Signified dependency and cognitive deficit. And again, of course, many of these people do have some cognitive deficits, but in many cases, it's really pretty related to certain areas or maybe needs a bit more time. And responses to or rejection to care is seen as being without purpose or disruptive and deemed as typical of a condition rather than being a possibly rational response. or even just simple grumpiness. I mean, why should you have your dinner when it's time for the ward to say you have your dinner? So the signal of a disease condition actually led to a lack of attention to the person. Often the sign was looked at rather than the person, and this often led to failure to even attempt to communicate with the person. Now, really importantly, this all led to institutional cultures of looping. So a looping effect has been called the way in which a classification can interact with the people being classified. And Goffman identified this process of looping within this total institution, describing it as an agency that creates a defensive response on the part of the inmate. When he's talking about inmate, he's talking about people in hospital. The inmate takes the very response as the target of its next attack. So it just reinforces the idea that there's something wrong with this person. And again, I also really do want to emphasize that my colleagues didn't find any bad treatment on the part of the staff. We're talking about what happens within the institution. You get negative bias feedback loops. So in future work, we wanted to sort of examine how this happens with data and records. And we see some parallels with concerns in AI about how algorithmic bias can get baked into the system, which is one of the reasons why we're sort of thinking about this in tandem with how you might think about developing technology, because one of the other ways where problems might arise would be in the use of data within a hospital system. So just a few conclusions. The cognitive deficit model of dementia isn't wrong, but we're entranced by it and it can act to eclipse the person. So if we use this cognitive deficit model of dementia as a way to try to solve problems with AI and robotics, it might accelerate decline even more. The background implicit values of a hospital ward merge very easily with some of the background implicit values of technology. And these are still values, but we need to unearth them and to see them clearly so we can work out when to take a step backwards. And since we're talking about such serious and potentially really depressing issues, I thought I'd end on a lighter note. A suggestion that comes from my colleagues' work about technology where it's really needed. So when I was reading through my colleagues' data, they've got vast amounts of data, over and over and over again, we laughed at this. Descriptions of patients struggling to open packets of biscuits, struggling to open yogurts, struggling to open packets of sandwiches, because they're so hard, it's really hard for somebody, especially if you're a bit older or not very well, to actually open them. So we were joking, but actually what we really want is technology where it's needed, packets of biscuits that you can actually open. And then lastly, there are a couple of papers we've written about this. I don't think either of them are open access, but if you're interested, just email me and I can send you copies. So that's it.
Thank you, Dr. Boddington. Very enjoyable talk. So we'll do, if anyone wasn't here for last time, the Q&A system is that you can type it into the question and answer section and then vote for the question which you would like to be answered as well, or multiple questions. And we'll try and take as many questions as we can, just starting from the most voted ones. So let's just take a 5-minute break or so to generate some questions. I think the only difference compared to last time was that last time I read them out. I think this time I'll just give you your microphone and you can ask your own question when we call on you. So we'll come back at 10:02 and answer some questions. Is that okay, Paula?
Yeah. No, sorry, I ran on slightly, but
it's all right. Okay, see you in 5 then.
Okay, so we do have a question. Paul Crump on the chat. So I don't know if you can see it, Paula, but
let's look. Oh yeah. So I'll read it out. So can understandings of the human, those living with dementia, be significantly altered within the existing organizational culture? Can we tinker with a system, produce a different understanding of a human, thus different care practices, or does the system need to be abandoned and rebuilt? Yes. Thanks very much for that question. But my colleagues are concerned with how we can introduce, because we're talking about the NHS. One of the things we're doing is trying to introduce changes that are going to actually cost nothing or virtually nothing. Although actually many of the changes would actually save an awful lot of money. The system can be tinkered with quite a lot, actually, I think. One of the problems that happens, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I actually mentioned the thing about packets of biscuits, which is not actually just a joke, is actually really real. That actually that sort of thing happens. That people might be unable to feed themselves. And one of the reasons for often swift decline in hospital is inadequate nutrition, and inadequate hydration as well, actually, because often people are confused because of dehydration. That's a really common cause of confusion. And one of the things we also really stress is that this is stressful for the staff. The staff want to produce good care, and one of the biggest reasons for staff burnout is realizing you're unable to produce the best care that you possibly can. So the tightly organized timetables of hospitals could perhaps be relaxed. Some of it is possibly to do with the design of the hospital ward. But here's one example, actually, with comparison from different hospital sites. So the issue, why it's called one of the reasons why it's called wandering wards, is because of people getting up and walking around and then being in danger of absconding. Now, that could be a danger if somebody with dementia who's very ill just actually manages to leave the hospital ward. They could actually end up in danger, so that is a problem. But interestingly, just based on a few observations, patients who were on wards where the doors were locked actually had more freedom to move around, so that they were able to walk around because the staff weren't worried about them absconding because the ward was locked. So little changes of that can make quite a big difference. So I think, and actually even what's one of the reasons why we talked about the signs and symbols, introduced with really good intentions, but sadly not working very well. So I really do think that they can be, and my colleagues are. I'm not involved in this part of the work, involved in doing training, in training for people. But again, in terms of assisting, work we hope to do in the future is integrating this with how you might look at the use of implementation of technology. This kind of really looking closely at what's happening is really critical. We need to look at the organizational culture and what's actually going on before we can possibly possibly really think about whether or not technology might make things worse, or is even actually looking at a genuine problem. So, I mean, here's another example of how the system could easily be altered. There's a campaign started a few years ago by a lady living in Wales, I believe, whose husband died with dementia, called John's Campaign, which is campaigning to allow greater access to families and friends onto the hospital wards to help to care for their patients, for their relatives, because they would obviously know their relatives far better than any hospital staff. And again, when we're talking about acute wards, so the patients are maybe not built on them for a long time. So something like that could actually make quite a big difference to the experience people are having. Is there anything else you wanted to come back on that?
You can unmute yourself, Paul, if you want to respond.
Okay, no, yes, yeah. Okay, another question.
Oh, he said no. Michael, do you want to read out your question? You can again just unmute yourself as well.
Yep. So the idea is, dementia care work seems particularly important place to get the role of AI and robotics right, recognizing that we tend to lose whatever capacities we outsource to artificial systems. Is there a risk that particularly in these kind of care spaces that we might outsource care and care practice and thereby lose that capacity? How do we, does that seem like a big risk to you, or how do we navigate that that line? How do we draw that line between these systems supporting our capacity to provide the care and then kind of it becoming a crutch and relying on it? And I don't know.
Yes, yes, another really great question. I do want to say actually that one of the since I've been working in AI and ethics, I mean, I've worked on lots of different applied areas of ethics in my career, and I really think this is actually the most interesting and potentially really fruitful area, because one of the things it's doing by highlighting the ways in which technology might clash with our real human values is making us really have to look really closely at what those values are. So I think it's actually really exciting. So if you look at work in projected works about the future of what technology might do to the future of work, one of the projections is that actually we're going to actually realise that technology can't really take over care work like this. And one of the things that it could potentially do is make people realise that real intricacy and value of his care work. So I was thinking about this a few weeks ago when there's a video by, there's a talk by Michael Osborne, who's, you might know of him, he's Professor of Machine Learning at Oxford, and he's done a lot of work on the future of work. And he gave a talk a couple of years ago, which I happened to see, where one of the things in the talk he was talking about whether or not we might be able to introduce robotics onto a hospital ward, and seeing this as a potential place where we could introduce robots because hospital wards are so regimented, which I mean, it just cracked us laughing, because there's a sense in which they're regimented, a sense in which they're completely chaotic. You've got the lady coming around with the trolley of newspapers, you've got people visiting, you've got the social worker comes on to see somebody, the OT comes on to see somebody else, someone's trying to get out of bed, somebody falls over, there's diarrhea on the floor. They're completely chaotic. But it's realizing that kind of thing, the difficulty of the implementation of these things, which is going to actually make us realize how complex it is, but also actually what's going on in the interactions. It's really commonly suggested now, and in different contexts. So it's commonly suggested that, say, if you have a care robot helping to look after like an older person who's living on their own and needs to take medication, because of course it's really common that you don't have to have dementia. Many older people are on routine medications for one thing or another. And actually, it's not just older people. People in general are absolutely terrible at remembering to take their medicine. So one suggestion is that the robot could remind you to take your medicine. But assisting or doing the medicines round on a hospital ward is incredibly complex. It sounds as if we're being really critical of staff, but often we are really impressed at the skill with which people negotiate complex interactions with people. So there are often really, people have just arrived in hospital, they normally take medication at home, they look at what they've been given and it's not the same as what they get at home. So what you're going to do, you're going to question it, aren't you? You're going to question it, and are often really, maybe it's a generic and it's a different colour, the dose is different, the doctor's to change a medication, or there's one you've been prescribed, you never take it because it interacts badly with you. But really complex interactions. So I think that there's a risk that we might think that these things are really simple, but they're simply, oh, take your medicine. It's not like that. It's much more complex. So there's a risk that we could think, and then one of the reasons why we're interested in looking at the hierarchies of what's going on in the hospital is because there's a hierarchical thing with the. Obviously, there's got to be a hierarchy in a hospital. There's obviously got to be a hierarchy. You have to have people in charge. You have to have rules. We have standards of medical law and ethics. We have, medical knowledge. But what tends to happen is that people at the bottom of the hierarchy who are delivering routine care work are often completely ignored. This is something I feel really strongly about because I've done this work, and you often know much more about the patient than anybody else because you're the person who's spending time with them. That knowledge is in danger of not being taken sufficiently seriously. But yeah, I'm sorry, I get too enthusiastic and talk at too great. So they're right. There is a risk. There is a risk that we might think that this is simple and it's not. It really is not. And if you look at, I hope some of you might enjoy reading the book. And the book itself is only a snapshot of some of the data. There are so many instances when having the time, it's the time. When staff have got the time to pay attention to the person, so somebody who seems to be, almost an invisible clump of hospital gowns hidden in a bed can come alive, and you can realise, well, this person's got far more capacity than we thought. Sorry, I go on too long. Is that helping to answer your question? So I think there's potential for really thinking. Why have we been thinking that people on hospital wards who are helping with cleanliness and feeding and continence care and so on, why do we think they're doing a low-grade job? Think about it. This is the highest job you could do, relating to another human being as they're living the last few years of their lives. So I'm going to get all emotional now.
To be honest, that's a beautiful response. Thank you. My mother is a nurse, and bedside manner and the sort of the intensity of humanity and human care that is involved in that kind of thing really comes out, and whenever she speaks about it. And so I heard you do something very interesting there, where the question when I posed it was, we'll reduce the task of care to this very defined thing that we can outsource to a machine. And I hear you saying that, well, investigation of this space, what we can do with artificial systems, invites an investigation of just how complex and profound this space is, and we may, upon doing that investigation, go, oh heck, this is a really big and beautiful thing, and have a better sense of what is worth keeping the human involved in and worth getting, leaving out. Is that about right?
That's why we're so passionate about this work. Actually,
That's wonderful.
Katie here. You could talk to Katie. She's fantastic.
Thank you. That's wonderful.
Okay, we have a question from Zed Turner. I'm going to allow you to talk if you want to ask it.
Okay. Yes. Zed. Yeah.
Zoe, sorry, I didn't put my name on.
Right.
I just realised it came up. Just from what you said, and also your interaction with the person before, our healthcare services are very paternalistic in their approach, and I worry that we wouldn't do, as Michael suggested, recognise the beauty of the interactions that we have, but rather go the other way and try to control them. So by using robotics, you remove that interaction between the patient saying, well, this isn't the right medication because it's a robot that they're talking to. Are we putting barriers up to further fix our paternalistic structures that we have currently in healthcare that we as patients are constantly battling with?
Well, yes. So I hope so. Sorry, I'm checking on your question. But I do think actually, just want to say one thing. There is some potential for these. There is some potential for maybe some sort of assistive technology. For example, in helping people to use the toilet, because just use that as a quick example about how there could be potential that could be positive, because the arm of a project that we're actually doing the analysis on at the moment is about continence care, which is obviously critically important, but it's not something that, funnily enough, I don't have many colleagues in philosophy who spend much time talking about the ethics of toileting practices, but it's critically important. And one of the things that tends to happen is it tends to become very, very public when once you're in hospital, in particular if you're older or if you're living with dementia. And there's a potential that we could have, say, more assistance within the toilets, or assistance to help people reach the toilet rather than being put in a continence pad or being asked to use a commode, but could actually be really, really helpful for people to gain more dignity. But yeah, the risk. There is a risk actually that it could be sort of really that we could have sort of top-down use of it. One of the risks, I think, is one of the reasons why I mentioned briefly issues about data and how data is recorded. That could be, depending on what data you're looking at. So we need to have a really careful account of how we should record actually what's going on. But I've got a feeling I'm not really answering your question, Zoe. Do you want to say more about?
No, but I think every time you speak, there's some more things that come from it, which is amazing and wonderful. Thank you. Because I work in data in the NHS, and I do feel that we don't, as data analysts, always consider the ethics of what we collect or what we could try and get people to collect. We're always making our lives easier. Yes. And I think that's what happens throughout healthcare. Yes. So you've really got three intelligences that you're considering. You've got the patient's yes. view, or their carers, which you said as people coming in and relatives, yes. the healthcare people. Maybe the system actually has its own intelligence that we don't really capture, actually it's for, and then anything that we introduce with robotics and artificial intelligence. I just feel that we might be more sided towards the healthcare and the system, maybe not the patient, like the staff in it, making it run more smoothly, and the friction factor is always the patients.
Yes, and there needs to be so much more points of communication between all these different factors. So one of the other factors is relatives. So my colleagues observed over and over and over again relatives trying to talk to the nurses, say to tell them things about their relative, and often without success. But of course, again, that's not a criticism of the nurses, because they're often really busy. One of the ways in which one would hope that we could use technology intelligently would be to free up time of recording, but in order to do that, you would have to make certain that the data is being recorded really adequately. So actually, in terms of recording data, this is looking at what actually happens in practice is a really good lesson for how you might think everything's fine because you've got recorded data, you put it into a system. Somebody can gain and lose a diagnosis of dementia on a hospital ward from one shift to the next. So how do you record that? And I've often thought about, as I get more and more grey hairs, oh, I've got to be really careful going to hospital just in case. Yeah. So yeah, thanks for your contribution. Thanks. Actually, there's another question coming up. Shall I turn to that one now, or did you want to add anything more, Zoe?
No, that's fine. Thank you ever so much. And hopefully I could track you down and talk about it a bit more in terms of ethics and data analysis. Thank you.
Yeah, please do that, because actually on the next project we've got a grant in for. As part of it is looking at gulf between recorded data and what's going on. So please do that. It'd be brilliant.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye. So there's a question from Anna.
Thank you. Yeah, I've enabled your microphone, Anna, if you want to ask it live.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thanks for the talk. That was really interesting. So maybe it's a little bit not right on the topic, but I have a question about what you think about this. So provided that interaction with social robots, such as a therapy robot Paro, can have a positive effect on patients with dementia, for example, that it makes it easier for them to open up for human beings as well again, I wonder what you think about whether it is appropriate to achieve this goal by misleading patients about whether those companions are artificial or not.
A brilliant question. Again, thank you so much for asking this. Yes, because of course, social robots can be really beneficial and therapeutic. Actually, I was sent a little. I should have brought it. A little kind of like furry kind of robot-y thing, but for use for children to help them calm their emotions. It kind of like gets upset and then you pat it and stuff. I love it, actually. That's really great. Just because I'm on my own in lockdown. But the question you ask about misleading patients, that's a really, really important question that we haven't looked at. This particular question, we haven't actually included it in our research, but one of the things that people have noticed in the wards is that you'll have seen, it's similar to the question of what happens in wards and with dementia care of, for example, doing like fake scenes like a pub or a railway or a view which looks like there's a window you can see out. This was most notably spoken of by one of my colleagues who had been in a particular hospital that was in a part of the country with the most spectacular, beautiful views out of a window, and they'd painted like views on the ceiling, which why wouldn't look out the window? It's like one of the most beautiful areas of Britain. But one of the things that my colleagues really strongly suspect is that many of the patients with dementia actually know it's fake. They actually know and become confused. So I really wouldn't think that misleading patients, it could actually really happen. It could actually really happen. And also one of the things that of course happens is that we know full well. I mean, like, you know full well that you're like a favourite teddy or something isn't actually real, but you can still treat them as though you know full well. Like, I mean, pets are a good example. So we know full well that pets are really complex, intelligent creatures who have proper relationships with us. But then, but we often know that we're actually over attributing that, and that just seems to be something that is part of what it is to be a human. But I don't really think that misleading patients is. I don't think misleading patients is really. Yeah, it's really complex. I wouldn't have thought it was a goal. I would have thought it'd be something to try to avoid, potentially because actually patients are not necessarily misled at all, and they can become quite confused. But that's the beginnings of an answer. But it's yeah. Thanks for asking the question. I mean, certainly anything that could have a positive impact on patients is of course really, really useful. And the patients with dementia can be calmed by things like the robot Paro, and I'm not surprised because I myself have been calmed by the little toad robot I've been given. I love it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Paula. We're just about out of time for questions, so thanks for speaking. It was very good, and thanks for all of the questions.